Good. This is as we said before, this is a really important session because it deals with some of the issues that are affecting our business today and possibly could affect all of our businesses tomorrow. We have a great panel, and I'll call you up in a minute. Dr. Jana Moser from Axel Springer, head of digital. Kostas Rozoglou from head of public policy in Yelp. Nicholas Fuder, Managing Director of Compass, and of course everybody knows Stephanie, the head of our EU affairs. So I would like to invite you guys up to the stage.
Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she changes from day to day. I wanna tell her that I love her a lot, but I gotta get a belly full of wine. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, someday I'm gonna make her mine, oh yeah. Someday I'm gonna make her mine, oh yeah. Someday I'm gonna make her mine, oh yeah. Someday I'm gonna make her mine.
Hello everyone. So thanks very much for joining us today. So we're going to have a session, this panel session about the major legislative issues that we're currently seeing happening in the EU and also global issues because they are affecting companies everywhere in the world. And we thought that we do that on a panel discussion rather than, a pure formal PowerPoint presentation, which to make it more lively. Also one thing is that we're going to go through a set of issues with my fellow panel partners. And it's just also, if you have any direct questions from the audience, please feel free to raise your hand whenever we're talking, because we want that to be as interactive as possible. So first, Kim already did the introductions, but it's a real pleasure to have here on the stage Kostas Rozoglou, who is the head of EU public policy at Yelp, Jana Moser, who is the head of digital data innovation at Axel Springer, and Nicholas Futter, the managing director of Compass Austria. So they all have their own specificity, I would say, but the common point that we all have is obviously data. And we're all managing data, we're all using data as the core asset of our business. And of course, managing data means also that you have to cope with some data protection rules. And I'm sure every one of you is in the audience is aware of the changes that is taking place at the European Union level with the adoption of the new European Data Protection Regulation coming in. So my first question to the panelists is going to be, how do you see the impact of the European Data Protection Regulation coming to your businesses, and how do you foresee that the practical impact on your business is gonna what do you foresee the practical impact on your business is gonna be? So, Kostas, if you want to start.
Does it work? Yeah, it works. So many thanks for the invitation. And yes, as you rightly said, the new data protection rules is a big challenge for any company. Yelp is a big company, so I think we're in a position to say, okay, we have a legal team, we know how to go through the legislation, but when you think about the startups or the small and medium enterprises, and I think in Europe, like more or less 95% of all companies are small and medium enterprises. They will struggle to deal with the new legislation for many reasons. First of all, because if I'm a startup, a small company, what I want is legal certainty. I want to make sure that the rules I have in front of me, I know how to apply them, and there is no derogation, one rule across Europe. The result of the whole legislative process that lasted for 4 years is a mix of harmonization and issues to be solved a bit later. There is still space for national authorities to take a different approach. Many issues where we still have to wait a couple of years until the rules are implemented. So we do not have a fully harmonized framework, because that could really make a difference for any company doing business in Europe. If I want to process data across Europe, it's much easier if I know that wherever I process the data, I need to comply with one set of rules. Now there are still issues where data protection authorities in every country can take a different approach, national courts might take a different approach, and there's a lot of legal uncertainty. And also, I think there will be a shift to compliance rather than innovation, because any company, even before I launch my company, or even if I launch a new idea, I have to make an impact assessment, I need to consult with the data protection authorities, I need to think about all the data protection implications of a new service that I don't even know if it's going to work. So I think that if I'm a startup or a new company and I want to hire 10 people, the first 2 will be a lawyer and a data protection officer who will help me to understand how I need to comply with the legislation. So I don't think that it's to the benefit of the European innovation that companies will have to invest so much in compliance rather than innovation. I think these are the main challenges. And of course there are other issues related to the fines if something goes wrong, but I'll leave it there, and I'm sure that there will be more issues.
I totally agree with you. The first goal was of the data protection regulation to have something like a harmonization, a full harmonization. I think that's a goal we haven't really met. Additionally, we wanted to have something like a level playing field with the US American companies. And that's something we haven't met either, because the problem is that, as you've already mentioned and described, we have to comply with the European regulation. In the future, of course, the US American companies have to do the same. But the problem is, in the future, to which companies will the authorities go firstly? They will come to us as European companies, because it's easier then to enforce the European regulation here in Europe than abroad, of course. But nevertheless, as you've already mentioned, we will have in the future, right now, many requirements we have to meet. And the point is, right now, it is very easy, on the one hand, to collect a lot of data, and we have to monetize it. And that's the challenge we have in the future. And how can we do that to monetize the data? We have to collect it on the one hand and to create profiles. And each of you and each of your company, you have some data, but the point is, you have the data, but you can't really use it because most of you don't have the consent. And in the future, you need the consent. So beginning from, I think, May 2018, about that, you will need consent to create profiles, personalized profiles. Although you think maybe that you don't have personal identifiable information, so-called PII, you have definitely, because the IP address, the cookie ID, etc., everything will be PII, and you will need the consent then to use these profiles. And the smaller the company is, the more difficult is it for you to get the consent, because who wants to register on your website, and who wants to use your services without a registration? Most people think something is for free. I don't want to register, so why should I give you any consent? So you will not be able to personalize your websites. And those of you who have been at Google yesterday have seen how much they do with data. They personalize the websites, they personalize the services, they really make interesting services based on data. So if you are not able to do this, and you won't without using data, you will have a significant disadvantage in the future in comparison to your competitors. And that's something we will have to face in the future. For example, Yelp, there is a need to register. But other services, especially only marketing-based or advertisement-based services, will have a significant disadvantage in the future regarding, based now on this new regulation.
Well, much has been said already. I think the data protection regulation is one of the worst pieces of legislation we got in the recent years. It meant to harmonize data protection issues all across Europe. Actually, there are 60 national allowances to define or regulate it in your national legislation. And 60 possible differences between the regulation in the different countries make it nearly impossible to really deal with this. Another issue is that against the usual case, the regulation is not went into force immediately, but has 2 years transition time, like a directive and not like a regulation. So that's all about harmonization, which did not work at all, and unluckily the member states, of course, were in charge of that. Not the Commission. The Commission wanted a harmonized level playing field. The member states wanted their own playing fields. That's always the problem with European legislation. So when you set up a company or a company that is working in different countries under different legislations, then you will have a problem in finding the right way of bringing your service into the country, because you will have to comply to every national legislation where your service will be applicable or used. So in a different or in a problematic case, you might be under 28 different legislations with the service you do in the European Union, besides legislations you would have outside the European Union. Just a little funny remark from the Austrian point of view, and most of you know that I'm Austrian. In Austria, we have the very unusual situation that a legal person has the same level of data protection than a natural person, which is unique in Europe. And actually, the European legislation will help us to get rid of this, though, of course, the Austrian regulators want to keep it up. So a legal person should have the same protection as a natural person. We are working against this, and in this case, I have to say that luckily the European legislation is helping us out of this problem.
So I think one interesting point that you mentioned is that consent, and it's really important for everyone to understand on what legal grounds you're going to be able to process the data when the data protection regulation is going to be really in place, so in May 2018. And consent is obviously the major legal ground where you all need to rely on. So the problem is, how do you get the consent if you are a third-party data provider and you're not in direct contact with the initial subscriber? And the second thing is, how do you think there is some room for maneuver in this legitimate interest ground that has prevailed into the data regulation, but it's still very unclear how the National Data Protection Authority are going to authorize that. So do you have any insights on these two parts?
Well, in Austria, you have the problem that at the time now, we already have the problem that in many cases the national data protection authorities want a real positive, active consent. So it's not enough to have agreement on the general terms of trade or whatever. They want a positive agreement or a positive response to the question, do you want this? And this makes it very, very difficult.
I'd like to add one other thing, and that's there is an e-privacy directive, you know that, and the e-privacy directive, at least in Germany, is you can find that in a special law right now, and that's called the cookie law, and many professionals now think and discuss if the European data protection regulation really replaces the cookie profiling which we have right now with the e-privacy directive. And so even the e-privacy directive will now be revised in the future. And so regarding cookie profiling, nothing is set yet. But I think from my perspective, you've already mentioned this, I think it's Article 6, right? Where you can balance the different interests and say, for example, that pseudonymous data profiling is not so bad, and therewith it's covered with this law without an explicit consent. But I think in the future, and that's the problem we have right now, is that many big companies will set the benchmark regarding cookies and cookie consent. So although we think, for example, we just created a cookie profile just based on some clicks, etc., and we try to minimize the data set which is processed. And we would maybe then be fine with just a cookie bar or something like that, and consent regarding this cookie. The other companies, the big ones, will have the consent. And the authorities will have a look at the big companies and say, okay, they get the consent for this kind of cookie profiling. So why you as a smaller company, you do the same, you create cookie profiles, etc., or similar profiles, click profiles, why don't you have the consent? So, and that's the problem we will have in the future. So although it might be possible to interpret it under this law and with Article 6, in the future, the others will set the benchmark, the big ones, and it will be our disadvantage in the end.
Just one is on the consent, which is really like, there's no logic behind this explicit consent, because if you look at it from the consumer perspective, nothing will change, because that means that I will still have to, as a user, I'm supposed to have read like 10 pages and clicked at the bottom, and that means I explicitly consented, so I consented to whatever. So, and there's nothing in the regulation that would allow for innovative solution how to get the consent. It's simply like asking the companies to explain in clear language what the processor will be. But there's nothing about promoting industry standards, about how to develop innovative solutions that the user can actually get some minimum information, understand what's going to happen, what he gets in exchange, and then maybe give his consent. So it's not really protective for the user, it's counterproductive for everybody.
Yeah, so I guess maybe it's going to be a new business differentiator that if you're able to integrate privacy in embedded solutions which are, native and easy to use for the consumer from the very beginning, and this all goes to the data protection by design and by default provisions, which are enshrined into the regulation. But as you said, they are saying nothing and they are not putting in place any standards or principles. So maybe one tip for all the guys here in the room is to really think about innovative solutions to embed privacy in your things.
And I'd like to add another point. We discuss all the time privacy and data protection. I think that's quite important. I mean, I believe in privacy, but the point is we discuss it all the time, and we discuss privacy by design, etc. But the real cool features and services, they don't talk about privacy. It's just something you can see under the cover, so to say. So it's nothing you can sell. Privacy is not an USP. You just have to do your job. And that's the reason why privacy by default and by design, that's necessary and it's mandatory in the future, but it's nothing you can sell. I mean, have a look at all these features yesterday at Google and all these Hello Google things, and they collect the data, they collect your voice, they create everything, they create huge profiles of you. And you just like it because the services are good. And we have to concentrate on the consumer side. We have to concentrate does the consumer really want? And not, okay, I have to comply with the law, how can I create maybe the terms and conditions and the consent, and here a tick box and there. Just integrate it in your services in a very smooth and lean way, but don't try to sell it and don't try to be over-transparent.
I like this one. Yeah, I don't know if you have any more comments on the data protection, and if anyone in the room has any questions, just feel free to raise your hand. I think, this leads us also to other important parts that are discussed right now in the European Union, which is the whole overarching strategy of the digital single market and the very ambitious goal here again that the commissioners have set to try to come with a kind of a very big horizontal approach to how do you provide the European digital single market effectively. My first question is, obviously, they are trying to do that at European level. Is there a sense in that? Because we all know it's global, so it's kind of difficult to see that. And the second is, do you think that the regulators are really to get to grips to what the consumer really wants? And because we can see from the data protection subject that being prescriptive, is really contrary to the user's needs. So how do you think that we could bridge that and this will to have a big digital single market strategy with the expectations of the user?
Well, let me start here. What I see as a misled political tendency is that we are opening the European digital market through data protection, through net neutrality, through the digital single market approach to the OTTs, the Googles, Facebooks, and this world. And we have no European answer to that. And this is a type of regulation which I see as a little problematic, because we don't create a market where European companies have any chance to compete with those companies. And the digital single market, as good as it is to have, a level playing field in technical terms on the availability of broadband and so forth and so forth, what happens now is that the mobile operators, for example, through the roaming regulation, which is a pain for everybody of us, but it gets really, really, really much money out of their pocket. And in many markets, the mobile operators are at the edge of economic well-being. So if I take their money from them, then they won't be able to invest more, and they won't be able to create services and products for the benefit of the user. At the end, all this together with net neutrality, we end up with a European digital market, a European digital infrastructure, which is basically the pipe, and just the technical pipe for any other service than European services. And that's what I see as a real political problem that we're facing here. It was not the total answer to your question, but...
It's kind of, it's linked to the competition, and I was going to throw the OTT stuff on the water, so you did.
Yeah, one point is that I have the impression that the EU approach when it comes to the digital single market is more like reactive to the big players who are already established. And instead of focusing how can we help the Estonian small company go cross-border and expand to Europe, we try to create even more regulations for everybody. At the end of the day, the big players have the means to comply with the regulations. But if I'm a Romanian startup innovator who wants to have a brilliant idea, I'm limited to Romania. I cannot go cross-border because I do not have the means, the lawyers, I don't have the capital yet to comply with all these different regulations. And there is a discussion that there is no legislation about the platforms. There's a lot of legislation about platforms. Yelp, we have to comply with consumer protection legislation, with copyright legislation, with data protection legislation. So I think the focus should be more like to mainstream, streamline a little bit the legislation, assess what we have. Is it appropriate? Is it not? And if we need less rules, let's create less rules, and better focus on clarifying what we have. Like give clarity to all the companies. This is a checklist. This is 10 things you need to do in order to comply, in order to go cross-border. And facilitate them to go cross-border. Create, unified VAT system. Simple things like simple registration. And then, of course, you have the competition enforcement, which I still believe in it. It's a strong tool, at least at European level. So if a company abuses its power, then you have the tools to make them comply with the rules. And this could be the answer. Instead of creating more legislation, more regulation, enforce what we currently have and clarify it.
I think we've said now a lot about how unhappy we are with regulation. We should never forget that the regulation and the harmonization in Europe, the goal is to strengthen one of our human rights. So just to say that, privacy is very important, but additionally, we should not forget, and that's another point, especially the regulators and the politicians forget, is that we have to gain some money in comparison, especially to other companies in other big countries. If it's the US, it doesn't really matter. But the question is, how can we do that? And we have to find a balance between the interests of the companies and the commercial interests and the interests of the consumer and the rights. And we all are consumers in this way. So we have to find a balance. And so whenever each of you has the possibility to describe the impact of the regulation and give examples to maybe some associations and some regulators or politicians how this data protection regulation affects your company, you should definitely support them, because the politicians don't understand what you do. They are not really involved in online services. They just repeat what others tell them. And so it's very, very important that whenever you have the chance to describe the impact of the regulation on your business, that you give these examples to find this balance, because the balance is necessary. Otherwise, we will have this over-regulation which we see right now. So I just can ask you to support the associations as much as possible.
Steph, okay, we have questions. Okay, Eduardo first.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not very aware of the details of the new regulations, but I would just ask two questions. Google, for instance, has google.co.uk, google.fr, and so on and so on. Facebook collects much more information than Google, and I can give you some examples. They are using the WhatsApp, your contacts in WhatsApp, to try to and suggest contacts that only exist in WhatsApp, and they suddenly that person appears as a suggestion to be your friend. Nowhere else they could have gathered that information. But Facebook, differently from Google, is brfacebook.com. It is ukfacebook.com. It's located outside of Europe. So my question, if you, a foreign company outside of Europe may own a domain in an European country, I imagine, and is it different? What will happen? Because with companies that gather information and are outside of the European community, so they're outside of the law, right? Because what can they do? Forbid people to use the Facebook? I don't think that's going to last.
Yeah, I think this is the whole challenge of the territoriality principle that is into this regulation, which basically says that no matter where the company is located, as long as you are targeted people who are in the European Union, then you should obey the European Union rules. The whole problem is what's targeting people, and how are you going to enforce this thing if you realize that there was a breach. These are the two questions, and there's no practical answer so far, because it's going to be done at the national level in the end. So this is the most important disadvantage that is still existing. Agree.
But this is strongly connected with the safe harbor or privacy shield regulation with the US, which we know is again at stake. So we'll see how this develops. But what we had as a tendency was, of course, that these companies, US-based companies usually, they stored part of the data concerning European users on European servers, which made it sort of like a little easier for them, which is not the solution, because still the US authorities would have access to the data, and this was the whole problem of the safe harbor issue.
Well, that depends where you who owns where it is located, because it doesn't have to be the U.S., right? There's many countries like Switzerland, like Uruguay. There are many countries that not, I'm not talking about British Virgin Islands, okay? I'm talking about real countries, and they don't really care about what's done outside their borders. So the reason I'm talking, because I don't think, being an outsider, that this legislation is not aimed for our group, okay? It's much, much broader than that, and what they really have in mind is Facebook, Google, and all the data miners that are there, and we are, a minority here. We won't be able to change it. We won't be able to change it. So the best way, I suggest, is that you have how to cope with it, okay? And there are every law has loopholes, period. And then how legally you use the loophole, okay? I'll give you, for instance, our example. Our site is owned by an Uruguayan company. All the servers are out in the cloud. So it could be anywhere in the world. So nothing is done in Brazil. So if somebody complains about something, say, well, go to Uruguay. We only sell ads. We are selling agents for that Uruguayan company. We only sell ads, period. You have complaints about your ad? Talk to us. You have complaints about your listing? Talk to the owner of and that's it. So maybe European legislation will be a more strict than that, but really, what can they do? Okay, a judge in Brazil shut down told the telephone companies to shut down WhatsApp. The ruling was up for 3 hours. It was reverted by a higher court in 3 hours because it stopped the country. So can you imagine? So okay, there's not going to be any Facebook in France. What's going to happen?
But I think, Eduardo, I'd like to make a comment on your comment. I think one of the issues here and what they're talking about is even if it's aimed at these other players, what it's basically doing is the innovation and stopping the innovation and the startups within the European community. And I would like, if it's okay, we talk a lot about this in Europe, and we have Neg Norton here from the U.S. And if I'd like to ask Neg, the head of the Local Search Association, if these kind of discussions go on in the United States, or if people are aware of Safe Harbor.
So I'm far from the public policy. I should stand up. I'm far from the public policy expert at the LSA, but I think there's probably 4 issues that we've been focused on that are impacting us these days. One is there is still some print distribution issues which have largely been dealt with because we have a process for people to opt out of phone books. And so once we put in that opt-out site, that has really sort of mitigated a lot of the legislation around directory distribution. And so now there's really 3 other issues that we're dealing with. We're dealing with privacy issues, we're dealing with publisher liability issues, and we're dealing with advertising tax issues. And so there's a lot of governments are broke in the States, and everybody's looking to raise money. And today, advertising is a deductible business expense for small businesses, so there's some discussion about the removal of that deductibility of advertising. And so there's a number of studies around that show the economic impact that we rely on to refute that legislation. And then there's some attempts to have publishers and website owners, search engines, agencies be responsible for the content of the advertising that's published on that website. And that's contrary to a lot of sort of legal precedents around that. So we've been fighting that. And then the last issue, as these guys have been discussing, is really around privacy. And there's some bills that are introduced from time to time around privacy. But I think we're still in the states sorting out, and there's different rules between states. how, what information should be protected, how businesses should operate. There's still some dialogue around that. And most of the legislation tends to be fairly clumsy and all-encompassing. And so we've been pretty successful in refuting, some of that legislation once we can articulate how it impacts our members. So the issues have morphed a little bit, away from print to digital issues. And but anyway, I think those are the three other digital issues that we've been focused on lately. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Neg. And Oscar, do you want anything going on in Asia, or they don't really care? They don't care? Okay. So, that's where all the servers are.
Too many countries, yeah. Well, actually, Asia, we're talking about a continent that has too many countries. So, if you talk about China, then, there's no privacy at all. None whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. Give it back to you.
I think so. If we don't have any more questions, I'm just going to thank Jana, Kostas, and Nikki for this very interesting and interesting talk. And just to say that we will all be around, so here for the day and for the dinner. So feel free to come to us and ask some questions. Thanks very much.